Buffalo were by far the most dangerous animal. He had wounded a buffalo and went into the thicket after it, and the buffalo gored him and almost killed him. He was laying there limp in a pool of blood, and he tells the story how the buffalo licked his blood next to his body and decided he was dead and walked away. Not many people who follow my channel are aware that I was a professional hunter in Africa for 5 years. Seeing as I just published a book on the subject, I figured now would be a time to talk about it. So my career as a professional hunter was really unexpected. I did not grow up hunting. No one in my family hunted at all. I grew up reading stories about Africa, about hunting adventures in Africa. And so I was obsessed with this idea of going to Africa and working there. So for like a year, 18, 19 years old, I was sending out emails to different safari outfits, whether it was hunting, fishing, photographic, it didn't matter. I was just trying to get a job in the African bush. And I got turned down a lot. I got ignored mostly. And I had pretty much given up this idea that I would be able to do that that early in life. So at 19, I was pretty depressed. You know, I was dressing up in a suit and tie every day, going to a job I hated. I was following this college path that everybody was telling me to follow. You know, I was a straight A student, but I really didn't like what I was doing. And one day I was like staying up really late. I was on the internet and I was following these hunting forums, and I found somebody mentioned this guy's name, Eric Mararv, a Swedish guy who had just started a hunting outfit in a country called the Central African Republic, which I had never even heard of. And so I looked this guy up from his website, and I see, you know, it's a very run by young people out in the middle of this African bush. It just seemed so wild. It was not like a high-end safari company. And so I just sent Eric an unsolicited email, just kind of almost acting like a client, like a prospective client, just kind of inquiring about his work and what that looked like. We exchanged a couple emails, and I didn't outright ask for a job, but he could tell I was super interested. And so out of the blue, he emailed me back and he offered me a job. And what he offered me was a 9-month internship, unpaid. He would pay for everything, but I had to commit to 9 months. Now, keep in mind, at this time, I was, you know, a super sheltered Midwest kid. I had been homeschooled my whole life. I was still a virgin. I was like super innocent. I had never, ever traveled, you know, beyond the states around me. I'd never been outside of the country. But I was in such a state of mind then that I needed to get out that I agreed to it immediately. And I got my passport. I got all the vaccinations I needed, you know, malaria pills, and I just set off into the unknown. And I met this guy in Paris, and we flew to the Central African Republic. And as you can imagine, it was instant shell shock, totally different culture. Just, you know, the corruption in the military, the police, you got a sense that like it wasn't as safe as America, and you had to like watch your back. You had to be very careful about how you talk to people. So long story short, that 9 months, I basically immersed myself in the work in the bush, probably more so than like a normal professional hunter apprentice would. I basically just decided to connect with the local African, you know, meat hunters that worked for us, and I basically they were my mentors. I basically went out in the bush and just had them teach me as much as they could in that 9 months. And I learned the language Sango pretty fluently that first year. Yeah, I was out that first year. I wasn't doing any hunting really, other than for me, I was like shooting small forest duikers, you know, red-flanked duikers, bush duikers, warthogs. I was shooting those for meat in order to feed me and my crew of Africans. There'd be about 10 of us, and we'd head out in the bush and just cut new roads and cut new hunting trails and just explore the area. So that's what my first year looked like. In the Central African Republic at the time, you had to do 2 full years as an apprentice, and then your 3rd year, you were able to test to get your guide license. And we did things kind of differently. I had proven myself so competent in the bush and in hunting and animal sign that the 2nd year, my boss let me guide my first hunts. And to keep things legal, He had me hunt with a Central African professional hunter, a licensed guide. And so he kind of, I don't want to downplay his role. So without him, his name was George. Without him, I would not have been successful. He really was a mentor. And like I said, he was the licensed PH, so it kept everything legal. However, he kind of stepped back. He made sure the safari operated well and successfully, but he also let me do my thing. So I was the one in charge of that first year of those hunts. And it's ironic because I started off my career hunting buffalo, and I had read about how dangerous they were, but I was so used to hunting them because it was the first animal I learned to hunt, and I was immersed in the process of, tracking them, learning the sign, spotting a mature bull, that I kind of forgot about the danger side of it. And George, this African PH, he had a scar in his chest from when he was like 20 years old, when he was still a poacher up north of the country. He had wounded a buffalo and went into the thicket after it, probably with a single shot homemade shotgun. And the buffalo gored him and almost killed him. Actually, he was laying there limp in a pool of blood, and he tells the story how the buffalo licked his blood next to his body and decided he was dead and walked away. So George knew the dangers of hunting buffaloes, and he was well aware of them. I had hunted a few buffalo up to that point, and they were like textbook, hunts, tracking half a day, catching up to the animals, making a perfect shot, boom, like done. No danger involved. The clients made good shots, and so those were my first experiences. And towards the end of that year, I was guiding a buffalo hunt, and we had stalked this herd all morning, late into the morning. And we get up to them, and the big herd bull separated from the cows and was on this hillside, and it wasn't very far. The client, I think he was a Scandinavian client, he made a good shot, and the bull just dropped. One shot from a 375 Holland right behind the shoulder. It just dropped. And, I'm like, okay, it's done, all done. Again, successful buffalo hunt. And as I'm walking up to the animal, the African PH, George, he says, hey, you might want to load your rifle. He's telling me this in Sango. And I'm looking at this buffalo, at this point, he's like 50 yards away, and I'm like, he's dead. Like, you can see a pool of blood around him. He's like not moving. And George is like, I don't know, something doesn't feel right. That thing dropped too easily. So as I'm walking, I'm loading a cartridge in my rifle, and I'm using a 4.58 Watt 500 grain, shoots a 500 grain bullet, big rifle. So I load a round in, and as I load this round in, I'm now only a few feet away from the buffalo. I see the image in my mind clearly now, all these years later. The buffalo just pops up, like defied the imagination. Like, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I heard George's like quiet little voice, like, okay, he's like, are you gonna shoot it? So it took me a second to realize what was happening. At this point, the buffalo is just facing me, and he's like getting on his feet. So I start firing, and I only have 3 rounds in my rifle. And I start firing. I'm not even thinking at the time. I'm so inexperienced. I'm so close, I could have brain shot him, but I'm like shooting here. I don't know why. So I send 2 rounds here, and the buffalo is not moving at all. He's still coming at us. And at this point, the client starts shooting and starts unloading his rifle. And finally, with the last bullet, after the client had shot, the bull lowered its head, and I was able to send one bullet just right behind his boss, severing his spinal cord, and he just dropped. And needless to say, after that, I did not take buffalo hunting lightly. And I had quite a few close calls after that as well. Maybe I'll tell those stories another time. Buffalo were by far the most dangerous animal I personally hunted. As an apprentice, I was involved with some lion hunts, which were really exciting. In the Central African Republic, the bush is really thick. You can't like track them or bait them the same way you can in other parts of Africa. They don't they don't hang out in big prides, like they spread out and they hunt in pairs. And so locating them was very difficult. And so how we hunted them in the Central African Republic is we used a big metal horn with like an animal skin wrapped around it, and we would do the the lion, like what people call a roar. We would imitate that, and we would attract the dominant males in the area who would come to check us out, like, who is this? What is this thing? And that was really exciting. Around the Shinko River where we hunted, what made it so exciting was you didn't always see them, but late at night when we were camped out in the bush, we would, like, whether we were opening roads or cutting new roads, we would just be sleeping by our campfires with nothing, sometimes a mosquito net, and that's it, no shelter. And we would hear that really loud roaring. Sometimes we'd hear hyenas, we'd hear leopards. But yeah, you rarely saw the animals because the bush was so thick, but you knew they were there. One time I did end up bumping into a male lion in the long grass at really close range, and we both got a scare from that, and luckily the animal didn't charge me. I hunted leopard more often than I hunted lion, and that was an exciting experience, learning to outsmart them. Like, people think baiting a leopard is pretty easy, but it's actually very challenging to find an area where the leopard will walk its territory and find your bait. And then tricking them to come while you're in the blind was also super challenging. In this book I just published, I write about how I was guiding this client, and we were in the blind, and we had bumped the leopard when we were walking into the blind. He was actually in the tree, which gave us a little bit of a scare, and he ran away. So we get in the blind, and later in the evening the leopard comes back, and this thing is stretched full out across the tree branch, and I'm like trying to tell my client that it's right there, and my client, like, he's looking, he cannot see this leopard, and it's maybe 30 yards away up in a tree. So I don't know if he just didn't believe me. I don't know what the deal was, but he starts moving around in the blind like he's got ants on his legs. So he starts moving around. This leopard just immediately starts growling at us. Like, the client's looking around, and I'm like, it's right there. So the leopard gets scared and it leaves, and I'm whispering to the client, I'm like, the leopard was there, and he's still, I don't know if he didn't believe me or what, but again in the evening the leopard comes back, and the client is still moving around being loud, and that leopard just lets out like a huge growl, and finally the client can hear, and he's like pointing at the tree like, oh my God, there's the leopard. And I'm like, yeah, no shit. And so needless to say, the hunt did not work out. The leopard ran out of the tree again and was gone. You had to learn to move about the bush safely, and it was not something you could learn in a handbook. You just had to learn it from being out there. Crocodiles were a big fear of mine, although they weren't as visible as in other places, like in Tanzania, where you have migrating animals crossing these rivers and the croc's just there. We still would encounter monster crocodiles on our rivers, and so, like, washing next to murky water when we were out in the bush, it was always something we did very carefully, intentionally not wash in the same spot multiple days in a row where you could get patterned by a crocodile. These Ugandan soldiers that were working in our area, backed by U.S. Special Forces that were hunting these rebels in our area, there was, on either end of our hunting concession, inside our hunting concession, we had the Vovodo River and the Shinko River. And within a couple years of these Ugandan soldiers doing foot patrols across the area, one guy was severely mauled by a crocodile in the Vovodo River, and one of these Ugandan soldiers in the Shinko River was actually killed, taken by a croc while crossing the water. So these were very real threats, something we just got used to and we were able to manage, and luckily nobody got hurt. Yeah, every day in the bush, very remarkable animal encounters, adventures became like everyday occurrences for us. And that's the thing I miss the most. But as I said at the beginning of this video, I recently self-published a book of short stories from my time as a professional hunter. I've included a lot of funny stories in there, a lot of exciting, dangerous stories, like, you know, almost getting outrun by a bushfire, encountering venomous snakes out in the bush. Yeah, exploring the bush with the Africans, learning to forage, learning survival skills, you know, surviving horrible illnesses and diseases. A number of dangerous animal encounters with buffalo, leopard. So yeah, that story is available. I'll include a link in the description. Yeah, I did that for 5 years. I got to work with some really amazing, experienced PHs from, whether they were from France, Zimbabwe, South Africa. I worked with some incredible people, and I learned a lot from them. And so I was a pretty gifted hunter, but 5 years, you know, is not a huge career compared to some of those guys I worked with who have been hunting for 20, 30 years in Africa. But ultimately, there's a number of reasons why I stopped doing it, and maybe those are stories for another time, but I had difficulty with some of the clients, very unethical people. And also, a civil war came to the Central African Republic. A lot of people were killed. A lot of people I knew were killed. Very tragic things happened. We actually had that infamous rebel group from Uganda, the Lord's Resistance Army. We had them hiding out in our area. We had Ugandan military backed by US Special Forces come into our area, and they were hunting these groups. The LRA ended up massacring a group of villagers that had worked for our safari company and who we knew personally, massacred them in our area. And when my boss and the camp manager reported it to the authorities, they were actually arrested and held in prison for many months. The government was basically saying, give us money. They were using it as blackmail, basically, like accusing us of killing the guys and saying, you're not going to get free unless you pay us. So it was a horrific event. Yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff like that happened. And ultimately, I ended up leaving, whereas some of my friends transferred and started working in like Tanzania. I ended up, yeah, just leaving. And I don't regret ending my career as a professional hunter. It was like a bucket list item for me. It was like a childhood dream. But ultimately, it was one of those life experiences that was incredible, but not something I needed to continue doing in order to feel fulfilled.